My girlfriend said, "I can walk away. Boys are begging for me." And I just pointed at the door and told her, "Great, there's the exit." She froze like I'd just spoken a language she didn't understand, because for the first time in our entire relationship, I wasn't scrambling to fix things or apologizing for crimes I didn't commit. The look on her face was pure shock, like her entire script had been ripped up right in front of her. She expected panic, maybe some groveling, definitely not calm indifference. That moment in my garage, surrounded by motorcycle parts and the smell of oil, was when I realized I'd been living in a pattern I didn't even recognize until it broke. Let me back up and explain how I got there, because this didn't start overnight. My name's Cole, I'm 29, and I work as a mechanical engineer in Denver. Decent salary, stable job, the kind of life where you can plan things and actually follow through. I've always been into technical stuff, problem solving, building things with my hands. My garage became my sanctuary over the years, especially after I bought this old Harley that needed serious work. Tearing down an engine, tracing electrical issues, getting everything running smooth again. That's my version of therapy. My girlfriend Marissa was different from me in almost every way. She was a freelance social media manager/influencer, which meant her income came in waves and her entire life revolved around image. When we met about a year and a half ago at this coffee shop downtown, she was photographing her latte for Instagram, and I thought her confidence was attractive. She had this energy, like she owned every room she walked into. For the first few months, everything felt easy. We'd order takeout, watch movies, and I genuinely thought I'd found someone special. 8 months in, she suggested moving in together. I had a decent 2-bedroom loft, and honestly, it made sense financially for her since freelancing meant unpredictable cash flow. I covered rent, utilities, groceries, streaming subscriptions, and what she called her work expenses, which included everything from ring lights to that fancy camera setup in the corner of our living room. She'd contribute when she landed a sponsored post, but she always framed it as her treating us or buying gifts, never as her share of the bills. The real problem started small. We'd be deciding where to eat, and if I suggested something she didn't like, her entire mood would shift. Arms crossed, that studied pose she'd perfected, and then the pause. She'd pick up her phone and start scrolling through her Instagram DMs, making sure I could see the screen. Messages from random guys, fire emojis, comments like, "Marry me," or "Let me take you to Aspen." Then she'd look up and say, "I don't have to deal with this, you know?" And like an idiot, I'd backtrack immediately, cancel whatever I'd planned, apologize for nothing. It became her nuclear option for every tiny disagreement. I wanted to work on the bike Saturday afternoon. She wanted me at some rooftop photo shoot as her accessory. Threat. I suggested ordering pizza instead of going out. Threat. I asked if we could split the grocery bill that month. Threat. Every single time, she'd weaponized the idea that other men wanted her, and I should be grateful she was choosing me. The worst part wasn't even the threats themselves. It was how effectively they worked. I'd feel this knot in my stomach, this panic that maybe I was being difficult, maybe I was taking her for granted, maybe I really was boring compared to whoever was sending her those messages. So I'd cave, cancel my plans, apologize for things I hadn't done wrong, and try harder to keep her happy. I was covering about 80% of our living costs, but whenever I brought it up, she'd pivot to talking about her personal brand, about investing in her future, about how relationships weren't supposed to be transactional. Except she had no problem being transactional when it suited her, dangling those DMs like evidence that I was replaceable. She'd built this whole online persona around knowing your worth and never settling. But at home, she made me feel worthless. I started walking on eggshells constantly, second-guessing everything I said or did, wondering when the next threat was coming. My focus at work started slipping. I stopped making plans with friends because I never knew when she'd need me for content, and I felt this low-grade anxiety humming in the background of everything. The only place I felt steady was in my garage, hands covered in grease, working through mechanical problems that actually had solutions. Engines don't manipulate you. They either run or they don't. That particular weekend, I'd blocked off the entire day to work on the Harley. I'd been planning this for 2 weeks, ordered parts, cleared my schedule, and I was finally making real progress. 3 hours in, I had the engine partially disassembled, parts organized on my workbench, and I was in that focused zone where nothing else existed. That's when Marissa appeared in the garage doorway, phone in hand, already annoyed. She told me we had to leave right now for a photo shoot on some downtown rooftop, that this was important for her image, that a boyfriend was supposed to be supportive. I didn't even look up from the torque wrench I was adjusting. I told her I'd planned this for weeks and she should go without me. Her expression shifted immediately into that familiar pattern, the crossed arms, the theatrical sigh, and then she pulled out her phone and started scrolling with exaggerated movements. She read off names like she was casting a spell. Hunter wants to take her to Aspen. Preston just opened a new steakhouse and wants her there. Kai keeps commenting about his Tesla. And then she delivered her favorite line, the one that had worked 50 times before. I can walk away. Boys are begging for me. This was the moment that should have made me panic, should have made me drop everything and scramble to fix whatever I'd broken. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, complete calm. I had oil on my hands, a torque spec sheet in front of me, and the mechanical reality of an engine that needed specific bolts tightened to specific pressures. Her theater suddenly felt incredibly small and far away. I looked at her, then at the garage door, and said the words that changed everything. Great, there's the exit. I turned back to my engine like nothing had happened, and for the first time since we'd been together, I didn't feel afraid of what came next. Here's what this first part of the story reveals about manipulation tactics in relationships. Notice how the pattern worked perfectly until the moment it didn't. When someone stops reacting with fear, the entire power dynamic collapses instantly. The lesson here is that emotional blackmail only functions when both people participate in the script. She stood there staring at me like I'd just slapped her, and I could see her brain trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in our relationship, her go-to weapon had failed completely. She stammered something about me not fighting for us, about how I was supposed to care, and I just kept my eyes on the engine. I told her she'd threatened to leave about 50 times and I was tired of it, that if she wanted to go, she should go, and if she wanted to stay, she needed to stop using other men as leverage. My voice was calm, almost flat, and I think that scared her more than if I'd yelled. She tried softening her tone, saying she didn't mean it like that, but I'd already checked out mentally. I went back to adjusting the torque on a cylinder head bolt, and she just stood there for another minute before turning around and walking out. I heard her car start up, heard the tires squeal as she pulled out of the driveway way too fast, and then silence. The weird part was I kept waiting for the panic to hit, for that familiar knot in my stomach telling me I'd made a huge mistake. But it never came. Instead, I felt this strange lightness, like I'd been holding my breath for months and finally exhaled. I worked in that garage for another 4 hours straight, finished the valve adjustment, cleaned my tools, and didn't think about her once. When I finally went inside that night, the apartment felt different, quieter, but not in a bad way. I made myself dinner, watched something on TV without checking my phone every 5 minutes, and slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up to 17 texts from her. The first few were angry, calling me cold and selfish, saying I'd embarrassed her by not showing up to her event. Then they shifted to sad, talking about how we could work through this, how she didn't mean the things she said. The last few were almost threatening, mentioning how many guys had asked where I was, how she could have left with any of them. I read them all over coffee and felt absolutely nothing. I didn't block her number because honestly, I wanted to see how far she'd take this. I just muted the notifications and went about my day. At work that week, my boss noticed I was actually focused during meetings for the first time in months and complimented a design solution I'd come up with. It sounds small, but it mattered because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be good at something without someone making me feel guilty about it. That weekend, I sat down and looked at my finances. I pulled up my bank statements and started categorizing everything: rent, utilities, groceries, her subscriptions, her equipment, dinners at places she wanted to go. When I added it all up, I was spending almost $3,000 a month on our lifestyle, and she was contributing maybe $400 when she had a good month. I opened a separate savings account that day and started moving money into it. I also signed up for an advanced CAD certification course that my company would partially reimburse, something I'd mentioned to Marissa months ago, and she'd made this face like I was choosing work over her, so I dropped it. Now I registered without hesitation. On Monday, 5 days after the garage incident, I called my buddy Evan. We'd been friends since college, but I'd barely talked to him in the past 6 months because Marissa always had something planned when he wanted to hang out. We met for beers and he asked what had been going on, said I'd basically disappeared. I gave him the short version and he just nodded like he'd been waiting for me to figure it out. Then he brought up this idea he'd mentioned before about restoring motorcycles and selling them, maybe turning it into a side business. We'd both talked about it years ago, but life got in the way, and suddenly it felt possible again. We spent 2 hours sketching out plans on napkins, talking about what kind of bikes we'd focus on, where we'd source parts, how we'd price labor. Meanwhile, Marissa's social media went into overdrive. She posted vague stories about toxic people and choosing yourself, the kind of stuff that gets 1,000 likes from people who have no idea what's actually happening. She posted a photo of flowers with a caption about a secret admirer, but I recognized her own handwriting on the card in the background. She started going out more, posting photos from expensive restaurants with strategic camera angles that made it look like she was on dates, but she was always alone in the actual shots. The whole thing was performance art designed to make me jealous, and the fact that I felt nothing was probably driving her crazy. Then, 8 days after our fight, she showed up at the apartment unannounced. I was working on design specs at my laptop when I heard her key in the door. She walked in, and she wasn't alone. There was some guy with her, tall, expensive watch, designer jacket, the whole package. She introduced him as Preston, made a point of mentioning he owned a restaurant downtown, and asked if I minded if they grabbed some of her things she'd forgotten. The way she said it, the way she positioned herself next to him, the little hand on his arm, it was all so calculated. I told them to go ahead and went back to my laptop. I could feel her watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction, but I just didn't have one to give. Here's where it got interesting though. Preston started looking around the apartment and noticed the motorcycle parts one had organized on the dining room table, pieces I was cataloging for the potential business with Evan. He asked what I was working on, and I showed him some before and after photos on my phone of a previous bike I'd finished. The guy lit up, started asking technical questions, mentioned he'd always wanted to get into bikes, but didn't know where to start. Marissa was standing there looking increasingly annoyed as Preston and I talked for 15 minutes about engine sizes and vintage models. She kept trying to redirect his attention, touching his arm, mentioning they needed to get going, but he was genuinely interested. Before they left, Preston asked for my contact info, said he might be interested in commissioning a custom build if I ever got serious about the business. I gave him my number, and he seemed genuinely enthusiastic. After they left, I sat there processing what had just happened. Marissa had brought this guy to make me jealous, to show me what I was losing, to prove that she had options and I should be devastated. Instead, her backup plan had just turned into a potential client. I started laughing, couldn't help it, because the irony was too perfect. This middle section demonstrates something crucial about manipulative behavior. When the original tactics fail, the attempts to regain control often become more desperate and transparent. Watch how someone's desperation reveals itself through increasingly elaborate performances that ultimately backfire because they're built on assumptions that no longer apply. That night, Preston texted asking about pricing for a full restoration on a vintage Indian Scout. He said he'd been thinking about it for years, and meeting me felt like a sign. I sent him a detailed quote that Evan and I had worked out for exactly that kind of project, and he responded within an hour saying he wanted to move forward. Just like that, her manipulation had backfired completely, and I realized something important. I didn't need her to fail for me to succeed. I just needed her to stop being in my way. Preston's project became the catalyst for everything. Evan and I started meeting every evening after work, planning out the restoration timeline, sourcing parts, setting up a proper workspace in my garage. Within 2 weeks, we had the Indian Scout stripped down to the frame and a waiting list of 3 more potential clients who'd heard about us through Preston. My income stayed steady from my engineering job, but now I had this side income building up in that separate account, and for the first time in years I felt like I was moving forward instead of just treading water. 3 weeks after the garage confrontation, Marissa texted saying her parents wanted us both at their anniversary dinner. She said it would look bad if I didn't come, that we needed to at least appear stable in front of her family. I almost said no, but her mom Karen had always been kind to me, so I agreed to go for her sake, not Marissa's. The dinner was at this upscale steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and waiters who describe every ingredient. Marissa's parents were there, her younger sister Lily, and the 2 of us. Marissa spent the first 20 minutes positioning us for photos, adjusting angles, making sure everything looked perfect for her Instagram. I went along with it because, honestly, I didn't care anymore. Her dad Thomas asked how work was going, and I mentioned the certification course I was finishing up and the motorcycle restoration business Evan and I had started. I could see him lean forward, actually interested, asking questions about the business model and profit margins. Thomas owned a small chain of auto parts stores, so he understood the industry, and we ended up having this genuinely engaging conversation about supply chains and customer acquisition. Marissa kept trying to steer things back to her content creation work, but her dad would politely acknowledge it and then turn back to me with another question. Then Karen asked how we were doing as a couple, one of those mom questions that seems innocent but isn't. Marissa launched into this rehearsed speech about how I'd become distant, how I prioritized motorcycles over our relationship, how she'd been trying so hard to make things work but felt unappreciated. She had this wounded tone down perfectly, and I could see her mom's expression shift to concern. But before I could respond, Thomas cut in with a question that changed the entire dynamic. He asked Marissa how she was contributing to the household finances, whether she was pulling her weight or if I was covering everything. You could see her freeze, trying to figure out how to spin it. She talked about her personal brand, about investing in her future, about how she brought other value to the relationship beyond money. Thomas just nodded slowly and asked what her monthly income averaged out to. And when she gave some vague non-answer, he looked at me and asked directly what percentage of our costs I was covering. I didn't want to embarrass her, but I also wasn't going to lie, so I said roughly 80%. The table went quiet for a second, and then Lily, who'd been scrolling through her phone, made this small noise and turned her screen toward her parents. She'd found Marissa's Instagram, the post from the past few weeks, the photos that were carefully cropped to suggest she was out with other men, the captions about knowing your worth and upgrade complete. Karen's face went from concerned to confused to disappointed in about 10 seconds. She asked Marissa directly if she'd been seeing other people while living in my apartment, and Marissa tried to backtrack, saying they were just friends, just networking, just content. But Lily kept scrolling, showing more photos, more suggestive captions, and the story Marissa had been trying to tell completely fell apart. Thomas looked at me and said something I wasn't expecting. He said I seemed like I had my life together and shouldn't settle for being someone's backup plan. The rest of the dinner was tense and awkward, and we left separately. I figured that was the end of it, that she'd move out quietly and we'd both move on. I was wrong. 2 days later, I came home from work to find suitcases staged by the door, ring lights set up in the living room, and Marissa wearing a white dress like she was going to a gallery opening. Her phone was on a tripod, recording, and she was live streaming to her followers. I could hear her mid-speech as I walked in, talking about leaving a relationship where she wasn't valued, about choosing herself, about how hard this decision was. The comments were rolling in with heart emojis and supportive messages, and I realized this was her final performance, the big dramatic exit she'd been building toward. I walked into frame calmly, still in my work clothes with grease under my fingernails from helping Evan during lunch break, and asked if she needed help carrying her bags to the car. The comments section immediately shifted. People were asking who I was, why I seemed so unbothered, whether this was actually mutual. Marissa's carefully constructed narrative started crumbling in real time. She tried to stay on script, but I could see her losing it. So I just stated the facts plainly. She'd threatened to leave over 50 times. She'd posted photos with other men to make me jealous. I'd asked her to either commit to the relationship respectfully or leave, and she'd chosen this. I wasn't angry, wasn't emotional, just honest. Then I picked up 2 of her suitcases and carried them to the door. She ended the stream abruptly, and that's when the real conversation happened. She broke down, admitted she didn't actually have anywhere to go, that the whole thing was for attention, that she wanted to talk and figure things out. She cycled through every tactic: tears, anger, promises to change, accusations that I was cold. But I'd had 3 weeks to get clear on what I wanted, and it wasn't this. I told her she could stay with her sister until she figured things out, that I'd give her a week to get the rest of her stuff, and that we were done. She tried one more time, saying she'd change, that she'd get a real job, that she'd stop with the social media games. I almost felt bad for her in that moment, because I could see she actually believed it. But I'd heard versions of this promise before, always after she'd pushed too far, and it never lasted. I told her I hoped she figured things out, but I was done being her safety net. She left that night, and the apartment went quiet in a way that felt permanent. The relief was overwhelming. Over the next 6 months, everything shifted. The restoration business took off beyond what Evan and I had projected. We ended up renting a small commercial space and hiring a part-time fabricator. I finished my certification and got a significant raise at my engineering job. I paid off my car, built up my savings, and started planning for a house with a real workshop. I also met Claire, a structural engineer I ran into at an industry conference. She had her own career, paid for her own life, and seemed genuinely baffled when I mentioned my ex used to threaten breakups as manipulation. Our second date, we split the check without even discussing it, and she got excited when I showed her photos of the bikes we were working on instead of seeing it as competition for her attention. It was shockingly easy, the way healthy things are. I ran into Marissa one more time at a motorcycle show where we were displaying a finished build. She looked different, less polished, more real. She apologized, actually apologized, said she'd been immature and insecure, and took it out on me. She saw Claire standing next to our booth and handled it gracefully, even complimented the bike we'd finished. I thanked her for the apology and told her I hoped she figured things out, and I meant it. Walking away from that conversation, I realized the most important thing I'd learned. Someone who actually loves you doesn't hold the relationship hostage, and the moment you stop being afraid of them leaving is the moment you get your power back. The biggest lesson from this entire experience is recognizing that a relationship built on fear and control isn't a relationship at all. It's a hostage situation with better lighting. Real partnership means both people feel secure enough to be honest without weaponizing the relationship itself, and the difference between manipulation and genuine care becomes crystal clear once you experience both. So here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone used threats to control you? And what finally made you realize you didn't have to play along anymore? And second question, do you think people who use these tactics can actually change, or is it just a pattern they'll repeat with the next person? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious how others have handled situations like this.